The Black Widow. The Black Widow of the climbing community. A sultry, daring brunette for whom men would throw rocks at each other and risk their lives. A skillful manipulator. A woman who used her sexuality to ease her ascent of the world's highest peaks. These are all things said about Chantal Mauduit, the most scandalous climber in the world with a controversial reputation. But let's start from the beginning. Chantal was born in France at the foot of the Alps and was familiar with winter sports from an early age. She initially took an interest in alpine skiing, but soon moved on to mountaineering. After obtaining a mountain guide certification, she began conquering the most challenging routes in France. At the age of 22, Chantal took third place in an ice climbing competition among 25 of Europe's strongest climbers. She was the only woman. The striking climber quickly caught attention. Chantal was accepted into the French National Mountaineering Association. Her first climb above 5,000 meters took place in the Andes, where she summited three 6-meter peaks including Oscaran, from which she descended by paraglider. This feat was so impressive that one of the climbers invited her to join an expedition to Everest. Chantal agreed. It was 1991. Climbing Everest is a climber's childhood dream. My dream. Without oxygen, without help. Like a cyclist climbing a pass without an engine, she wrote in her diary. Chantal did not reach the top, but from then on, she decided that she would only attempt 8,000-meter peaks. An ambitious goal, at any cost. She planned to do this in alpine style, without oxygen, and with minimal equipment. It should be noted that Chantal had a remarkable ability for quick acclimatization. She could withstand high altitudes better than many male climbers. At that time, mountaineering remained predominantly a male pursuit, and the attractive French woman was popular in base camps. She was accused of using her allure to manipulate male climbers. Allegedly, she enjoyed the competition among men for her attention. Witnesses said she often provoked them and had very liberal sexual morals. During her second attempt to climb Everest in 1991, her presence even caused an open conflict among climbers, leading to a fight and rock throwing. But how exactly could all this have helped her in her ascents? For a while, Chantal's attention was captured by American climber Thor Kaiser. He fell in love with her. They started dating and planned a joint ascent of Mount Fitzroy in Argentina. Climbing is not cheap, and they needed money. Chantal led tourists on various routes several times to earn money for this trip. However, shortly before the expedition, she told Thor that she had no money for the ticket. Desperate to see her, Thor took on extra work to pay for the tickets. They went to Argentina together. However, during the climb, their relationship began to fall apart. Several attempts to reach the summit failed, as did their attempts to mend their relationship. Journalist Jennifer Jordan wrote that before another attempt, Chantal gave Thor an ultimatum. If we reach the summit today, everything between us will be fine. Thor did not understand how this would change her attitude towards him, but took the challenge seriously. He led almost the entire route, correcting Chantal's minor mistakes. Focused, determined, and set on victory. By 11 in the evening, he was tackling a difficult section, with not much left to the summit. Exhausted and soaked, he stubbornly pressed on. Late at night, he grabbed a ledge and transferred his faith, but felt the rock shift beneath him. Thor realized the danger when it was too late. He was torn from the wall and plummeted down. The thought flashed through his mind. At least, I'm still alive. Tumbling from rock to rock and falling 20 meters, he landed on a wide ledge, alive but injured. His eyelid was torn, and his right arm was broken in several places. Other teams climbing nearby quickly came to his aid and lowered the climber to base camp. For Thor, the summit attempt was over. But it wasn't for Chantal. She announced that she would continue her attempts to summit the next morning with another team. I no longer love you. That's all she said to Thor Kaiser. The American returned home broken in every sense and even started seeing a psychologist. who advised him never to cross paths with this woman again, advice he quickly ignored. Learning that Chantal was now preparing to climb K2, Thor joined a Russian-American expedition. The team already included some of the strongest climbers, Americans Ed Visters and Scott Fisher, as well as Vladimir Baliberdin, the first Soviet climber to conquer Everest. Chantal was part of a Swiss team. The route was in Pakistan, a Muslim country with strict rules. However, Chantal felt unburdened by conventions there as well. According to other climbers, she disregarded local customs, walked alone in public places, and wore short shorts, risking unpleasant situations several times. After 19 days, she arrived at the K2 base camp and prepared for the ascent. It was decided to do it in alpine style again. This is an important detail because it implies not helping other climbers with setting up ropes, thus conserving strength. However, other climbers later noted how the Swiss team clipped into their ropes, benefiting from their work and making the climb easier. Chantal herself hated carrying heavy backpacks, and the men in the team carried all her gear. She gladly took advantage of their attention and help. Her own backpack was small and light. However, this was not her only trick. Many at the time believed that the Swiss team was not adequately prepared for the summit attempt. And when Chantal realized this, she broke Pakistani law and unauthorizedly joined the Soviet-American team. Doing so was forbidden, and she should have descended and left the country with her team. But Chantal decided otherwise. She accepted the invitation from her ex-boyfriend Thor Kaiser. While he set up ropes, carried gear to the base camp, and did other preparatory work, Chantal began sleeping with his partner, Ed Viesters. On July 28, Kaiser, Viesters, and Neil Bedelman set out from base camp to summit K2. They reached Camp 3 by July 30. Vladimir Baliberdin and Gennady Kapeka were 300 meters higher. Viesters and Bedelman slept in one tent, while Thor slept separately. During the night, he suddenly heard footsteps. It was Chantal. After waiting for the men to leave base camp, she quietly put on crampons, filled her water bottle, and headed up lightly. Meeting up with the rest of the team, they moved higher. But soon, Viesters and Bedelman expressed concerns about the weather and began descending. The other climbers continued their ascent. On July 31, the weather was clear. Thor was carrying a very heavy load, including a tent, a stove, a sleeping bag, food, and ropes. After a while, they had to leave some of their gear. They left their sleeping bags, rope, most of their food, and then it became easier to move. But nightfall stopped them. Thor suffered frostbite on his feet. Chantal, despite her thin jumpsuit, seemed impervious to the cold and handled the altitude very well. After a cold night, Thor decided to descend to retrieve the gear and bring back his sleeping bag. Chantal asked him to bring hers as well and stayed put. Obediently descending for the sleeping bags, Thor met climber Alexei Nikiforov, who helped him. However, they didn't reach Camp 4 and spent the night on the slope of K2. The ascent continued the next morning. On August 2, the trio reached Camp 4. There, they encountered Baliberdin and Kapeka descending. They were the first to summit via the Abruzzi spurs since 1986. After spending the night at an altitude of 8,600 meters, they were nearly exhausted. The climbers left a tent and sleeping bag for Nikiforov and hurried down. And finally, the time for the summit push arrived. Thor Kaiser woke up before dawn and began pricking trail through half a meter of snow. Alexei Nikiforov followed him, but 200 meters from the summit, Thor realized that he no longer had the strength to reach the top and descend alive. He had spent all his energy breaking the trail. Here's what Jennifer Jordan writes about it. Thor sat on the ridge, trying to spot Chantal and Alexei below to hand over the trail-breaking work. They were still small figures far below. Thor tried to cry, but his body couldn't complete with even the simplest commands. Suddenly, a strong, clear voice pierced his mind. If you want to leave, go down. Thor looked around. No one was there, but he stood up and began descending. Chantal was the last to leave camp. Following the broken trail, she quickly caught up with Alexei at the bottleneck. She passed him and met the descending Thor. Thor, come up with me. We'll summit together. The temptation was great, but Thor did not change his decision because he simply had no strength left. Whatever happens, know that you're a good guy, Chantal said to him. He replied that he would wait for her at Camp 4. This retreat would save not only his life but also the lives of Chantal and Alexei. As he began his descent, Thorkaiser found 50 meters of rope that Alexei had discarded, thinking he wouldn't need it anymore. Thor stopped, secured the rope to the ice, and created handrails in the most dangerous part of the bottleneck, so Chantal and Alexei could descend safely. Meanwhile, Chantal, who hadn't expended energy carrying gear to base camps, setting up ropes, or breaking trail through deep snow with her small backpack and truly remarkable acclimatization, became the fourth woman to reach the summit of K2 at 5 p.m. on August 3, 1992. It was indeed a significant achievement. She was at the pinnacle of her climbing success. K2, also known as the Savage Mountain, is one of the most technically challenging peaks. But her elation was short-lived. During the ascent, she lost her sunglasses. Her eyes were left unprotected from the cold, the tiny ice particles flying in the air, and most importantly, from the sun's ultraviolet rays, which at such altitudes can burn eyes in a matter of minutes. While on the summit, the climber realized that she had gone blind and could no longer descend on her own. She decided to crawl into a snow cave, dug 2 days earlier by Ballyburden, and began to freeze there. She couldn't descend by herself because she simply couldn't see where to go. Another cold night at such altitude was not something she could survive. But a miracle happened. Alexei, who was descending after her, found her in the cave. He just stumbled upon the freezing climber. He forced her to get up and began to descend together. Chantal, now blind, with frost-beaten hands and feet, kept falling asleep while walking. Alexei had to constantly leave the exhausted woman. Then the rope set up by Thor came to the rescue. Alexei clipped into the rope, but when he shifted his weight from one leg to the other, a crampon came loose from his boot, and he lost his balance. He fell several meters before the rope stopped him. When Alexei reached the tent, he was near death from altitude sickness, physical exhaustion, and cold. He literally collapsed into Thor's tent. "Where's Chantal?" Thor asked. "She was behind me," Alexei replied. 45 minutes later, Thor heard the crunch of snow and unsteady steps. With her hands stretched out in front of her like a child playing blind man's bluff, Chantal tried to find her way down. She couldn't see anything and was in a semi-conscious state but continued descending. Thor dragged her into the tent, removed her boots, and found her feet severely frost-beaten, but they could still be warmed. He quickly brewed tea, made soup, and fed them chocolate. After spending 3 days in Camp 4, about the so-called death zone at over 8,000 meters, Thorkaiser understood that his time was running out. At such altitudes, even resting doesn't allow for recovery. No matter how strong you are still slowly dying. And now he had to not only descend himself but also help 2 nearly lifeless climbers down. Despite everything, the 3 climbers began their descent the next afternoon. Alexei and Thor supported Chantal under her arms. She could barely move her legs. They would carry her a few meters and then sit on the ground to rest. Then they would get up again, repeating the process endlessly. In 3 hours, they covered no more than 60 meters. Thor worried that leading Chantal down the technically challenging slope at night would be tantamount to suicide. He decided to set up a tent. Chantal sat motionless in the snow. Alexei, evidently prioritizing his own survival, decided to continue his descent, leaving Chantal's rescue to Thor. Thor Kaiser, along with Chantal, prepared for another night at over 8,000 meters. The next day, the weather was excellent. Thor contacted Viesters and Fisher in Camp 3 via radio. They said Alexei had reached them the previous night and they were ready to come up and help bring Chantal down. As they ascended, Viesters and Fisher saw an avalanche-prone slope and roped up for safety. A short distance from the camp, Viesters suddenly felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up with a sense of impending danger. He immediately started digging a cave, hoping to bury himself under the avalanche before it started. Fisher watched him, not understanding what was happening. Suddenly, without warning, a wall of ice and snow struck him and hurled him down the slope from a great height. Viesters heard the crunch of the snow layer and looked up just as Fisher was being swept away by a wall of snow. Viesters dove into the hole he had dug, and the avalanche passed over him. But his reprieve was short-lived. The rope tightened and pulled him out of the hole like a fish on a line, dragging him hundreds of meters down the slope. He desperately tried to break with his ice axe. Eventually, he succeeded. He hooked onto a rock, and they hung just a few meters from a precipice. Neither of them was hurt, and they continued their ascent to rescue Chantal. Meanwhile, Thor continued to slowly lower Chantal down a rope. After a few hours, he met up with Viesters and Fisher, but by this time, Chantal was utterly exhausted. Viesters immediately opened his backpack and knelt before Chantal, saying that he had brought eye drops. He gently lifted her glasses and saw her swollen and bloodshot eyes. Together, they continued the descent to Camp 3. It took them another 2 days to reach Camp 1. By the end of the descent, Chantal felt better, enough to descend on her own. Ever cautious Viesters recalls that the ascent of K2 was the only time in his life when he broke his strict rule of always staying safe. In her recollections of the K2 climb, Chantal barely mentions her dire condition. She briefly notes that her eyes hurt and leaves it at that. Instead, she vividly describes how she was greeted at base camp, almost like a heroine. Here's what she writes. Charlie came with tea and cookies, and I fell into his arms. The Mexicans congratulated me, and the sweetness of human bonds filled me to the brim. The only person Chantal did not mention in her memoirs was the climber Thor Kaiser. He was not mentioned at all. Upon returning down, she faced a hefty fine for unauthorized climbing, which she simply tore up before leaving Pakistan. Interestingly, climber Gennady Kopeyka, in his tribute to Alexei Nikiforov, who later died on Everest, also downplayed Thor Kaiser's role in rescuing Chantal. Thor was merely mentioned as an unnamed American who turned back before reaching the summit. Kopeyka attributed the primary role in Chantal's rescue to Alexei Nikiforov, who, according to him, accompanied Chantal until other climbers arrived. Nikiforov himself claimed that Chantal did not reach the summit, as she had miscalculated her strength, but she was still credited with the ascent. After the death of Polish climber Wanda Rodkiewicz, Chantal remained the only woman to return alive from the summit of K2. She was welcomed back in France as a national hero. She no longer maintained a relationship with Thor. Within the climbing community, Chantal earned a controversial reputation. Many accused her of using men for her climbs, showing little concern for their safety and lives. She even earned the nickname Black Widow. However, climber Daniel Mazur writes this about her. Chantal was the antithesis of all this climbing mafia crap about big sponsors and tons of Sherpa support. She simply loved the mountains. All those guys bad-mouthing her behind her back just wanted to sleep with her. She did use her body to establish influence over men. And why not? She had the character of a winner. She wasn't always cheerful and happy. She had a damaged knee that hurt a lot. She wasn't always in great shape, but she was very strong. Sometimes she pushed herself too far. This dubious success on K2 allowed Chantal to find sponsors and return to Everest in the spring of 1993 with a New Zealand team. Although her team included 9 climbers and 8 high-altitude Sherpas, she claimed that she was climbing alone and much faster than her companions. This was another comment that caused immense irritation among those around her. She reached an altitude of 8,400 meters but was moving too slowly, was inadequately dressed for the cold, and decided to turn back, choosing a long life with her fingers over irreversible frostbite. She returned to the Nepalese side of Everest with a Spanish team in the fall of that year, but this time she only reached an altitude of 8,000 meters. Without official permission, she and climber Pemba Sherpa decided to illegally summit Shishapangma and Choa Wayu. They succeeded reaching both summits in October. Upon returning to Kathmandu, Chantal was again fined for illegal ascents, but without paying anything, she returned to France, cursing Himalayan bureaucracy for a long time. Next, Chantal went to Mount William in Antarctica, where a film was made about her. After this, she returning to Everest, this time attempting the previously unclimbed Northeast Ridge. By then, having gained popularity, she was a paying client of Russell Price expedition. Avalanches made the route impassable, and Chantal and the other clients were exhausted, so the expedition returned home. In 1995, she went back to Everest as a member of Rob Hall's expedition on the Southeast Ridge. Chantal reached the south summit at an altitude of 8,750 meters before turning back, or rather, before she was turned back. She was the slowest of Rob Hall's clients throughout the climb. When she stopped at the south summit, Rob placed a hand on her shoulder, insisting she descend. Chantal looked at him with blue, numb lips and unfocused eyes. She nodded quietly, unable to protest or even speak. After descending 30 meters, she collapsed on the slope and lost consciousness. Hall realized he would have to carry her down. Once again, at great personal risk and effort, several climbers, including Ed Viesters, who was rescuing Chantal for the second time, brought her down the mountain. They took her to the tents, where she received first aid, and Chantal quickly recovered. The next day, she was already enjoying herself in base camp, walking around as if nothing had happened. Hall returned furious, telling everyone he had dragged Chantal down like a sack of potatoes and that she was permanently banned from his expeditions. Chantal earned a reputation as a climber who constantly needed rescuing and who repeatedly endangered the lives of other climbers. She was openly called the Black Widow. Indeed, many climbers lost their opportunity to summit while rescuing Chantal, and some risked their lives. Thor Kaiser recalls, Chantal didn't care about herself. She didn't think about safety. I climbed with her because I loved her, not because it was safe. Chantal was like a Trojan Helen. She both infuriated and inspired thousands of climbers. In 1994, the French magazine Vertical wrote about her. The problem with Chantal is that her climbs seem too easy for us to take them seriously. And when British climber Alison Hargreaves died on K2, Chantal said, I admire her, but look, we are different. At least in that I'm still alive. After 6 unsuccessful attempts to summit Everest, Chantal switched her focus to Lhotse, a mountain that had not yet seen a female ascent. In 1996, she joined an American team to climb Lhotse. However, during the summit push, the weather worsened, bringing a hurricane and a blizzard, causing all her companions to turn back. Yet, Chantal stayed on the mountain, continued the ascent, and according to her, became the first woman to summit Lhotse. However, there is no evidence to support this claim. She climbed alone, had no witnesses, and brought back no summit photos. Claiming the camera froze, the wind was strong, and she hurried down. Many climbers, to put it mildly, stopped this ascent. For the record, the weather was indeed terrible. On that same day, Rob Hall and Scott Fisher perished on Everest. Meanwhile, Chantal claimed to have summited Lhotse solo. After Lhotse, Chantal ascended Manaslu, The French press immediately dubbed her the greatest female climber of the modern era. Thor Kaiser recalls her as having a certain power over men. She would joke, "Too many men and too little time." Often her former lovers would approach her, looking at her like a wolf at a sheep. She would look them straight in the face and say, "Oh, sorry, I don't remember. Have we met?" And finally, we come to a very strange conclusion to this story. In 1998, on Dal Lagiri, she was climbing with her partner Ansharing Sherpa, who was more of a friend than a paid porter. They set up their tent in Camp 2, near the tents of an Italian team. Franca Brunello warned Chantal about a crevasse higher up the route. She thanked him and closed herself in the tent with the Sherpa. That was the last time they were seen alive. The Italians decided to descend to wait out the snowstorm. Before leaving, they saw Chantal's tent half buried in snow but didn't approach it. When the storm passed, the Italian team returned to find Chantal's tent buried under snow. Concerned, they dug through the snow and found Chantal and Sherpa dead in their sleeping bags. Chantal had a deformed jaw and a broken neck. The Sherpa apparently suffocated. It's easy to see why this death seems strange to many. They didn't die during the ascent but in base camp, in their own tent. It is speculated that an ice block fell on them. However, there were no witnesses and no one saw what actually happened, so the true circumstances remain unknown. Chantal's body was transported to France, where it was cremated. She had written and elaborated with detailing how she wanted to be buried, including specific instructions. For example, after the mass, a loud recording of Chantal's laughter, recorded specifically for the occasion, was played. Her will has still not been fully executed. She wanted her ashes scattered in so many places that her relatives have yet to visit them all. This enigmatic end adds another layer to Chantal's already controversial legacy. The mystery of her death and her unusual final wishes reflect the complex and often contradictory nature of a climber who both inspired and frustrated the mountaineering community.